15 years after Allied forces invaded Afghanistan, is the country a safer, more prosperous place? The Taliban is once again back in control of territory. Al-Qaeda is asserting its influence again. And the poppy trade remains as prolific and as profitable as it ever was. We ask, after all the lives that have been lost, after all the money that's been spent, what's been achieved? I'm Martin Stamford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. It's 15 years since the United States led a coalition against the Taliban in Afghanistan in retaliation for the 9/11 attacks. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost since then, both amongst the coalition forces and civilians. And despite the official end to the conflict at the end of 2014, American and NATO forces are still supporting Afghan forces in the fight against the Taliban. So what does the future hold for the country? Insight's Dana Lewis reports.
Less than a month after al-Qaeda terrorists flew commercial airliners into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon, the bombing of Afghanistan began. October 7, 2011.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The U.S.-led NATO coalition was immediately successful in removing the Taliban regime, which supported al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. Afghanistan was liberated from oppression. Al-Qaeda training camps destroyed. A democratic government took shape. Schools reopened. But then al-Qaeda and the Taliban regrouped across the border in Pakistan. And over the last decade and a half, a bloody, seemingly endless insurgency has ground on. This past week, the Taliban briefly took the northern Afghan city of Kunduz before Afghan troops and U.S. forces brought it back under control. And Taliban fighters are threatening the city of Lashkar-Gah in the south. I spoke to U.S. Brigadier General Charles Cleveland from the Afghan capital, Kabul, about the state of the country and its future.
Well, Brigadier, let me begin by asking you, and forgive the bluntness, but is Afghanistan deteriorating and almost coming back under Taliban control?
In our view, it is absolutely not crumbling, and it is absolutely not about to fall under Taliban control. Overall, we have seen an improvement on the part of the Afghan security forces. And so what the significant changes that we've seen this year really do include that the Afghans have changed their larger strategy. They are now on the offense. They devised and have now executed a much larger campaign plan.
As we are doing this interview, there's a battle raging in Kunduz with the Taliban and the Afghan army. Member of parliament has been killed. The police chief has been killed. Surely that is not a good tiding of security in the country.
Since early August, there have been a series of Taliban attacks around the country, but by and large, the Afghans have stayed on their larger campaign plan. And as we look at really what the Taliban has tried to accomplish and what their goals were at the beginning of this fighting season, specifically to try and take over some larger population centers, the Afghans have been successful in defending their population and continuing along in their larger strategic campaign plan.
Key British and Canadian forces which battled for calm in the south of the country pulled out of Afghanistan 2 years ago. Opium production remains sky high, accounting for 90% of the world's heroin supply. And across Afghanistan, terror attacks have increased. Civilian deaths from al-Qaeda and Daesh attacks have soared to all-time highs in 2015, of more than 3,500 killed in suicide attacks, 7,400 injured, roughly a third of them children.
Well, tell me, how many districts does the Taliban now control? It's been reported that they have about 90 districts out of 400, and that's roughly 25%.
We think about 63% of the country is under government control, and again, about a 20+% is being contested right now. The Taliban control or influence about 9 or 10% of the Afghan population, and the other 20% of the country is really in play, and that's what the fight is over right now. Most important, we know that the Afghan people do not want to see a return of the Taliban.
U.S. forces, which once numbered over 100,000, are now down to 9,800 soldiers. As the Afghan army has grown, it's also suffered what many described as unsustainable losses in the fighting. President Obama has announced he will reduce U.S. troops to 8,400 by 2017. And in the wake of deteriorating security, will hand over the question of continued U.S. involvement in Afghanistan to the next American president.
15 years after airstrikes began in Afghanistan, and I remember because I was on the ground there, $500 billion spent, it seems like we're almost back to square one. What have we accomplished?
Respectfully, I would disagree that we're back to square one. Obviously, there is still progress to be made, and we still endeavor to work at that every single day. But first and foremost, I would tell you there have been no significant terrorist attacks that have been launched from Afghanistan or planned in Afghanistan that have assaulted the West, be it Europe or the United States. And so first and foremost is we've continued to protect our Western populations by this presence and by our efforts here. You can't help but notice the dramatic changes, whether it's the freedom of the press that is here, whether it's an elected and democratic government, whether it is education and literally millions of children that are going to school, whether it is an economy that clearly has work to go but is functioning and moving forward. And so what we really do believe is that there is still a hope that has been given to the country of Afghanistan.
NATO and America now openly point the finger at Pakistan for supporting and directing terrorists who use the Pakistani frontier to regroup and relaunch attacks in Afghanistan.
The problems of Afghanistan truly are regional problems, and so therefore they do require regional solutions. And our view is that wherever these terrorists may be, these nations in this region have got to work together to be able to address the sanctuaries as well as the terrorism threat.
If there are long-term hopes for peace, it may lie in efforts to hold so-called peace talks with the Taliban for a political settlement. But so far, the Taliban have ignored calls to reject violence in what today is a very fragile and unsteady Afghanistan. I'm Dana Lewis, reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined now by Hamid Haqqani, who is a research associate who specialises in Afghanistan from the think tank at Chatham House. And also with us is Heather Barr, who's a senior researcher, particularly on women's rights, from Human Rights Watch. Hamid, why do you think the Afghanistan of today is, by many people's opinion, worse or certainly no better than 15 years ago?
I think Afghanistan became a very complicated case of management of a post-conflict environment. In plain terms, I think there were just too many players trying to do things. The coordination initially from the international partners was not there. And then with the insurgency growing in early 2000s, there was not enough attention given to the fact that the Taliban could come back with lethal force. And increasingly, the disengagement of the Afghan elite that emerged post-2001 in terms of, involved in corruption, not paying attention to rural areas, this created a sense of disaffection among Afghans. So the reasons are complicated and they're multifaceted.
But you had a perfect storm, did you, of a slightly disinterested, demotivated American influence as the sort of aggressor coming in to sort out Afghanistan, or certainly leading the way. And then Afghanistans themselves were just fed up. They're exhausted, aren't they, after generations of conflict? And the two sides never really came together?
I mean, I was in Kabul when the Americans came and Taliban were removed. And I remember very clearly from across Afghanistan, people were quite enthusiastic and hopeful that something will happen. Because remember, between 1980s and this period of 2000, early 2000s, people were always keen for an international engagement and a sense of abandonment that was there after the Soviet had withdrawn. That was kind of coming in people's mind to an end.
Well, withdrawn or been driven away, depending on which side of history you're on, I guess.
Absolutely. But in 1989, when the Soviet Union left, and the 1992 civil war began afterwards, Afghans were just tired of fighting. And I know very clearly, from my experience being there, that the Afghans were very enthusiastic for this international engagement. So the Afghans welcomed internationals.
So there is a sense of palpable disappointment now.
Yeah.
And perhaps if we use an example of this in society through the lens of young women particularly. I remember reporting on the stories of, hey, girls are now allowed to go to school. What's happening now, Heather?
Well, there's been extraordinary progress on women's rights, and that's absolutely undeniable since 2001.
Irreversible progress?
Well, no, not necessarily irreversible, and that's the frightening part. And as you see the insecurity spreading across the country, the Taliban influence and control spreading across the country, you see real setbacks to the progress that has been made, and you see just how fragile that progress is. And one of the areas where we're particularly concerned that we're now seeing at least a stagnation, if not setbacks, is in the area of girls' education, which is the area that all of the countries that sent troops really point to as their one clear great success.
I mean, it's a photogenic issue, I suppose. Let's not kid ourselves. We saw pictures, didn't we, of soldiers helping build a school or extend a school or something like that, and this was seen or portrayed back to us in Western nations as a good thing. This was change coming to Afghanistan. Now, if it's being unravelled, is that, do you think, with the agreement of the Afghan people or against their better judgment?
I think, no, it's not with the agreement of the Afghan people at all. I think that the majority of Afghans felt, including during the Taliban regime, that girls should at least go to primary school. The majority of people felt that way. I don't know if you would agree with me. And I think that support for girls' education has grown since 2001. And what's happening now, though, is that the security situation is deteriorating and people are afraid. And families are often more afraid to send their girls to school than their boys to school. So when insecurity happens, the girls are sort of the first to feel that. And we know that at the high point, only about half of girls were going to school. And so one of the other things that's frustrating is while donors are continuing to spend money, the efforts to expand the education system and to bring more girls in really stagnated starting about 3 years ago. So the education system in Afghanistan is not expanding, and girls are being driven out of the system that does exist.
But that's an example of what I suppose many people would call waste, Ahmed, which you can extend to human life. You can extend to, I think the Americans have spent $800 billion, nearly $1 trillion in various ways supporting Afghanistan. It's all gone to waste.
I mean, the statistics that are there it's released by the US government between 2002 and 2015, I think the figure is something like $116 billion US, and 68% of that was for the military. The rest is all for humanitarian development. And it's a huge amount of money for a country that is relatively small, proportionally with a fewer population compared to its neighbors. For me, I think we have always been really focused in the West on numerical stuff, like the number of girls going to school, the number of schools being built. Afghans in Afghanistan, for example, for the work we've done in Chatham House, they've often talked about how institution building was seen by Westerners as erecting buildings where you bring in civil service. But that's not true. Institution building is beyond that. And it's the same with education. Yes, we have numerically far more people going to school, and that's wonderful. But what is the quality of education? I mean, we were in the Brussels conference, and the president of Afghanistan talked about this as one of his priorities, that he recognizes the quality of education is not delivering. For example, Afghans who are graduating from their universities are not employed anywhere outside their country because not even Afghans' neighbors look at their education system with an element of respect. I mean, this is just an example.
To what extent, though, have the Afghans able to, or why don't they, take a greater control in their own future? Why has there not been, if you like, a societal uprising against what we characterize as a retrograde step? Is it that people actually, in some areas, agree with the Taliban? They want them back in?
I mean, I think it would be very hard for people to rise up across the whole country, particularly given the sort of difficulties in infrastructure, in roads, and security, and communications, et cetera, and sort of come together. And in a sense, in some ways, the people they're frustrated with are not just the government, but the donors as well. I mean, sometimes people say that Afghanistan isn't a 12-year war, it's a one-year war fought 12 times. I mean, I think there's been a lot of lack of continuity in terms of strategy, both on the military side and on the development aid side. I think donors have sometimes found the government to be a difficult partner, particularly in the area of women's rights. So it's very difficult to see what the Afghan people can do beyond the local level, but I think they're trying in a lot of ways.
You paint a very disappointing picture, but we'll return to this subject, I'm sure. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to stay with Afghanistan in our next part of our program, focusing particularly on the illegal opium trade.